Microsoft once looked like the giant that had already had its moment. For a long time, the narrative in the technology sector was settled. Apple owned the hardware, Google owned the information, Facebook owned the attention. And Microsoft was the legacy utility, the provider of the software you were forced to use at work. It was the company of the beige desktop, the frustrating update, the rigid spreadsheet, and the uncool corporate IT department. Then, the next era of technology arrived. The landscape shifted violently, as it always does, and suddenly the boring layers that Microsoft controlled became the exact foundation that everyone else needed to survive. To understand how one of the oldest tech giants orchestrated the most profound turnaround in modern corporate history, we have to look past the surface. We have to stop looking at consumer products and start looking at infrastructure, Because the story of Microsoft is not a story of inventing the coolest new gadget or capturing the cultural zeitgeist. It is a masterclass in the quiet, methodical capture of the enterprise backbone. It is the story of how turning away from the spotlight allowed a company to build the stage upon which everyone else would eventually be forced to perform. Let us rewind to what financial analysts often call Microsoft's lost decade. Throughout the 2000s and early 2010s, the company appeared to be fighting and losing every relevant consumer war. While Steve Jobs was unveiling the iPhone and fundamentally altering human interaction, Microsoft was struggling to articulate a coherent vision for mobile, while Google was organizing the world's information and monetizing the internet through an undisputed monopoly on search. Microsoft's Bing was a distant, almost comical second. They chased Apple's iPod with the Zune, arriving too late and with too little. They chased the smartphone revolution with Windows Phone, bleeding billions of dollars for single-digit market share. They chased the tablet market with the confusing Surface RT. Their strategy felt purely reactive. It felt like a former champion desperately trying to prove it was still relevant to a younger demographic. The media and the markets judged Microsoft harshly. Their stock price stagnated for years, effectively flatlining while their Silicon Valley rivals saw exponential growth. The consensus was that Microsoft was a dinosaur, a sprawling bureaucracy entirely dependent on its twin legacy cash cows, Windows and Office. They were seen as a toll booth on a road that fewer and fewer people were choosing to drive on. As the world moved decisively away from desktop personal computers and toward mobile devices and web-based applications. But this public story, the story of a bumbling, out-of-touch tech giant, was deeply incomplete. It suffered from a profound blind spot that plagues most mainstream technology analysis, the consumer bias. As human beings, we tend to measure the success and power of a technology company by the products we interact with daily. We judge Apple by the sleek glass and steel in our pockets. We judge social media companies by the addictive feeds on our screens. Because Microsoft's consumer products were visibly failing to capture hearts and minds, the public assumed the company was failing systemically. What we missed was that while the consumer market is the most visible, it is rarely the most structurally critical. Beneath the fleshy, highly publicized battles for consumer attention, a quiet, invisible revolution was happening in the corporate world. The enterprise, the complex, sprawling, capital-heavy world of global business, governments, and institutions was changing. Companies across the globe were beginning to drown in their own data. They were realizing that purchasing, maintaining, and securing their own private servers was expensive, inefficient, and dangerously slow. They needed to outsource their computing power. They needed on-demand scale. They needed the cloud. And this is where the public perception of Microsoft drastically diverged from its internal reality. While the world was mocking the interface of Windows 8, Microsoft's engineers were quietly laying thousands of miles of fiber optic cables under the ocean. They were buying massive tracts of land in desolate, energy-rich areas. They were designing complex liquid cooling systems and pouring concrete for data centers the size of small cities. They were building Azure. They recognized a fundamental truth about the future of computing. The next era would not be defined entirely by the user interface, but by the physical and virtual infrastructure running beneath it. Software was eating the world, as the famous venture capital adage goes, but infrastructure was going to eat the software. If you owned the physical and virtual plumbing of the internet, the compute, the storage, the networking, you did not need to win the consumer's affection. You just needed to win the enterprise's trust. This was the hidden system. It was immensely unglamorous. It was invisible to the average person. Nobody lines up outside a store at midnight for the launch of a new server farm. Nobody writes glowing cultural essays about a back-end database migration. It was, by all conventional definitions, incredibly boring. But in the architecture of modern digital capitalism, boring is often a synonym for indispensable. However, building the infrastructure was only half the battle. To truly weaponize this hidden system and turn it into an insurmountable moat, Microsoft needed a profound shift in its corporate psychology. It needed a leader who understood that the company's past successes were now its biggest liabilities. It needed a philosophical reset. It needed someone who was willing to let go of the crippling ego of the Windows era and embrace the humble, highly lucrative reality of being a ubiquitous service provider. That leader was Satya Nadella. When Nadella assumed the role of CEO in 2014, he did not launch a massive consumer hardware division or declare war on Apple to reclaim the smartphone market. Instead, he executed one of the most ruthless, unsentimental, and effective strategic pivots in business history. He systematically dismantled the religion of Windows. For decades, Microsoft's operating model was predicated on a single, immovable doctrine: everything must serve the Windows operating system. If you wanted to use Microsoft Word, you needed a Windows PC. If you wanted to run Microsoft Enterprise tools, you needed Windows servers. Windows was the sun, and every other product was a planet required to stay in its gravitational pull. It was a strategy of coercion, essentially treating their software suite as a tax on the computing ecosystem. But Nadella understood that the sun had set. The mobile revolution had decentered the personal computer. By forcing its software to remain exclusive to its own failing platforms, Microsoft was actively limiting its own reach and accelerating its irrelevance. The philosophy shifted from a rigid Windows-first dogma to a fluid cloud-first reality. While that sounds like a generic corporate mandate, its operational implementation was structurally profound. It meant deploying Microsoft software on the very platforms that had defeated them. Suddenly, Office was beautifully optimized for the Apple iPad. Suddenly, Microsoft was actively embracing Linux, the open-source operating system the former leadership had actively campaigned against, and making it a first-class citizen on the Azure cloud. Suddenly, the company was no longer trying to trap the user in an exclusive walled garden. It was trying to be the underlying utility grid, supplying power regardless of whose hardware you were holding. This was a profound shift from capturing the interface to capturing the infrastructure. It was an acknowledgement that the enterprise market values interoperability, stability, and predictable integration far more than it values novelty. Amazon Web Services, or AWS, had invented the modern cloud market and enjoyed a massive multi-year head start. Google Cloud possessed arguably the best raw engineering talent and the deepest institutional knowledge of handling consumer data, but Microsoft had something vastly more valuable in the enterprise space: decades of deeply entrenched trust and legacy integration. 30 years, the chief information officers of the Fortune 500 had been buying from Microsoft. Their corporate identity systems ran on Microsoft Active Directory. Their databases ran on Microsoft Active Directory. Their databases ran on SQL Server. Their internal communications ran on Exchange. Their entire corporate bureaucracies, supply chains, and financial models functioned because of Excel. Microsoft did not have to knock on the front door and introduce itself to the enterprise world. It already held the keys to the building. While competitors asked massive corporations to abandon their existing on-premise hardware and move entirely into the public cloud, Microsoft offered a highly pragmatic alternative: the hybrid cloud. They allowed risk-averse institutions, global banks, healthcare networks, military defense contractors to keep their most sensitive, regulated data securely on their own servers, while smoothly extending their broader operations into Azure. They did not attempt to sell a radical technological revolution. They sold a seamless, secure bridge from the systems of the 1990s to the infrastructure of the 2020s. This enterprise positioning turned out to be an unstoppable force. By weaving its cloud infrastructure into the existing legacy fabric of global business, Microsoft created an ecosystem that was profoundly sticky. Once a multinational corporation integrated its global operations into Azure, migrating away became a multi-year, mathematically daunting nightmare that no executive wanted to authorize. The boring enterprise software had been successfully transformed into a high-switching cost monopoly. But the true strategic genius of building this massive planetary-scale infrastructure only became fully apparent when the next major technological paradigm arrived: the paradigm of artificial intelligence. For years, AI development was largely an academic pursuit. heavily constrained by a lack of processing power. But as machine learning evolved into deep learning, and deep learning evolved into massive large language models, the fundamental bottleneck shifted. The algorithm was no longer the sole constraint. The ultimate constraint became compute. Training a foundational world-class AI model requires an astronomical amount of physical hardware. It requires tens of thousands of highly specialized GPUs running at maximum capacity for months on end. These GPUs must be housed in specialized data centers with massive power grids, advanced liquid cooling mechanisms, and ultra-fast networking fabric to connect the chips. It is not a software engineering problem. It is an industrial-scale manufacturing process. But instead of forging steel or building automobiles, this infrastructure is forging neural networks. Software startups, no matter how brilliantly staffed, simply do not have the capital to build this physical reality. Even highly funded elite research labs cannot afford the billions of dollars required to stand up their own supercomputers from scratch. And this was the exact moment Microsoft's decade-long, unglamorous investment in boring data center infrastructure became its ultimate geopolitical weapon. When OpenAI, the research lab behind ChatGPT, realized they had cracked the mathematical code for generative AI, they simultaneously realized they were entirely out of computing power. To reach the next frontier of intelligence, they needed a partner with near-infinite physical infrastructure. Microsoft executed a transaction that fundamentally altered the trajectory of the tech industry. They invested billions of dollars into OpenAI, but crucially, a massive portion of that investment was not delivered in liquid cash. It was delivered in Azure compute credits. Microsoft essentially positioned itself as the exclusive landlord and primary power provider for the most important AI research company in the world. This arrangement was not a traditional venture capital investment. It was a symbiotic lock-in of unprecedented scale. By supplying the underlying compute, Microsoft engineered a scenario where the most advanced artificial intelligence in the world was natively optimized for and entirely dependent upon the Azure ecosystem. They did not just fund the gold rush of the 21st century, they established a monopoly on the highly specialized industrial-grade shovels, and they owned the only railroad leading into the mines. But owning the infrastructure to train these massive models was only the first layer of their strategy. The true power of Microsoft's transformation lies in how they utilize their boring legacy software to solve the hardest problem in the technology industry: distribution. In the hyper-competitive landscape of Silicon Valley, having a superior technological product is rarely enough to guarantee victory. The graveyard of tech history is overflowing with brilliant, innovative platforms that were fundamentally better than the incumbents, but failed because they could not reach the end user. Startups building standalone artificial intelligence tools suddenly faced a massive hurdle. They had to spend billions on marketing to acquire users, convince them to create new accounts, alter their daily habits, and remember to log into a completely separate website or application. Microsoft did not have this problem. They possessed the ultimate invisible distribution channel. Because they had spent the previous 30 years quietly embedding their software into the daily operational workflow of the global workforce, they did not have to convince a billion people to adopt a new AI application. They simply injected the intelligence directly into the tools those people were already forced to use every single day. This became known as Microsoft Copilot. But to view Copilot merely as a digital assistant is to misunderstand its strategic purpose. It is a distribution mechanism. By embedding advanced large language models into Word, Excel, PowerPoint, and Teams, Microsoft transformed their most mundane utilitarian software into the primary user interface for the AI revolution. Suddenly, drafting a complex legal contract, analyzing thousands of rows of financial data, or summarizing an hour-long corporate meeting did not require migrating to a new shiny tech startup's platform. It just required clicking a button inside the exact same software suite the corporate world had been using since the 1990s. They weaponized their own ubiquity. They leveraged the immense, unmovable inertia of corporate behavior. This brings us to the ultimate paradox of the enterprise AI revolution, and the core reason why Microsoft's infrastructure became an insurmountable moat. When revolutionary, disruptive technology emerges, it is inherently terrifying to large institutions. Artificial intelligence, with its propensity to hallucinate, its massive data ingestion requirements, and its black box architecture, represents a monumental security and compliance risk for global enterprises. A chief technology officer at a multinational bank or a global healthcare provider cannot simply upload their highly classified proprietary data into an open-source model or a consumer-grade chatbot. The regulatory fines, the risk of data leakage, and the potential for corporate espionage make it an absolute impossibility. They desperately want the productivity gains of AI, but they are paralyzed by the compliance risks. And this is where the boring layers, the deeply unsexy, highly regulated, invisible infrastructure that Microsoft spent decades building became their ultimate superpower. Microsoft did not go to the Fortune 500 and pitch them a wild, unregulated future of artificial intelligence. They went to the enterprise and offered AI perfectly wrapped in the impenetrable, enterprise-grade security architecture they had already trusted for decades. They offered artificial intelligence governed by the exact same compliance rules, data sovereignty laws, and Active Directory permissions that were already regulating their internal emails. Microsoft effectively said, you can have the most advanced cutting-edge intelligence in human history, and it will not violate a single line of your existing corporate security policy. No startup, regardless of how much venture capital they have raised, can replicate 30 years of enterprise compliance, security audits, and institutional trust. You cannot growth hack your way into a government defense contract. You cannot bypass the procurement department of a Fortune 50 corporation with a clever marketing campaign. You have to put in the decades of grueling, meticulous, deeply boring infrastructure work. Because Microsoft had done this work, they became the safe default choice. They became the inevitable gateway through which the traditional economy would access the future. Competitors could build slightly better models, but they could not match the distribution, and they absolutely could not match the underlying enterprise infrastructure. The battle was won before the consumer market even realized the rules of the game had changed. We can now look back at Microsoft's lost decade, not as a period of failure, but as a period of necessary, painful transition. While the public and the media were distracted by the superficial battles for consumer electronics and smartphone market share, Microsoft was retreating to the absolute foundational layers of the digital economy. They stopped trying to be the most exciting company in the world and decided instead to be the most essential. They understood that consumer attention is incredibly fickle. A teenager will abandon a social media app the moment a cooler, newer alternative arrives. A consumer will switch smartphone brands for a slightly better camera. But enterprise infrastructure is sticky, it is rigid. When a corporation builds its entire operational nervous system on top of your cloud architecture, they do not leave. This is the hidden reality of modern technological dominance. We are conditioned to celebrate the visionaries, the product designers, and the charismatic founders who unveil sleek consumer devices on brightly lit stages. But the true, enduring power in the global economy rarely sits on the surface. It lies deep underground in the massive, humming data centers, the thousands of miles of fiber optic cables, and the complex, bureaucratic compliance software that keeps the world running. The grand strategic lesson of Microsoft's historic resurrection is profound, and it applies far beyond the realm of software. It is a reminder that the narrative of the market is almost always trailing the reality of the architecture. The elements of a business that the public views as tedious, utilitarian, or legacy are often the exact elements constructing the highest barriers to entry. What is considered entirely boring and unglamorous in one technological cycle often becomes the most valuable, irreplaceable, and dominant asset in the next. The future is rarely built by those who chase the spotlight. It is built by those who are willing to quietly own the infrastructure beneath the stage. If you want to understand the hidden systems governing the world's most powerful companies and learn to see the architecture beneath the surface, subscribe to this channel. We don't just tell the story, we break down the machinery.